Hi, you're watching AniVerse English. It was a clear day at one of the city's construction sites. Work was in full swing. One of the workers, a young dark-haired man named Tony, received a message on his phone. It said that he, once again, did not pass the selection process at one of the companies. As it turned out, he had the right competencies, but they had restrictions on hiring employees, so he couldn't pass the interview. At that moment, someone called out to Tony, forcing him to close his phone. It was his partner, John, who asked if Tony was playing mobile games instead of working. Tony hastened to hide his phone and pretended to be harmless, saying that he had already finished his work and had nothing better to do. John incredulously asked him why a guy who had only been on the team for a year was doing so well. Tony didn't answer directly, but mentioned that he had been doing this since he left school, a fact he had talked about when they were sitting at the bar. He grinned, joking that John loses his memory after every drink. John was not very happy with this answer. Then Tony climbed onto the stepladder and began painting the walls, telling John that he could rest and smoke while he finished everything. At that moment, Tony's body was pierced by a terrible, strange sensation. John noticed this and asked what happened to him. Tony immediately grabbed his back, but insisted that he was fine. Despite this, his whole body continued to shake. He thought to himself that his painkillers were most likely wearing off. Due to the hard work, his back had begun to hurt very badly, with the pain becoming more frequent after he had lifted a panel 6 months ago. As evening came, the men left the construction site. One of the elders, Stephen, approached them. He asked why Tony was doing all the work and turned to John, clearly dissatisfied that Tony was taking on so much. John asked the boss why he liked Tony so much. The man replied that Tony was the only one who tried to complete everything on time, which is why he liked him, while John did not listen to him at all. The boss then approached Tony and asked how his back was. Tony said he was fine and thanked the man for his concern. Stephen asked if he was taking on too many responsibilities, to which Tony hesitated a little and admitted that he might have taken on too much work. Stephen then asked if Tony wanted to go for a drink with them, but Tony replied that he needed to go to the hospital because his painkillers had run out. Stephen said goodbye to him and wished him a good trip. Soon after, Tony got into a taxi and went about his business. While driving, he thought about his life and how he wouldn't be able to work until he took the pills. He wanted to find a less stressful position where he could feel physically good, but despite many applications, none of the companies accepted him. After some time, Tony arrived at the hospital, where he continued to reflect on why he was so unlucky. He thought about the fact that he wasn't accepted because he only applied for administrative positions. He feared that because of his back, he would no longer be able to bear heavy loads. Soon, the doctor, whose name was Hank, received Tony. As soon as he touched Tony's back, Tony yelped in pain, and tears flowed from his eyes. The doctor informed him that the intervertebral disc between the 4th and 5th vertebrae had worn out, and Tony could no longer lift weights. Tony did not object, saying that without work he would simply die of hunger. However, the doctor reminded him that he had already warned him about this many times. He asked if Tony really wanted to repeat his father's fate. At that moment, terrible memories flooded back for Tony. 13 years ago, during a change in settings, his father died in an accident. His father was working at a height when he suddenly fell. The company shifted the blame to the contractor, and its president suddenly disappeared. Thanks to lawyers, they were able to receive compensation of 25 million won, and since then, their family has been in a state of survival. Hank asked Tony what he would do if his mother found out about everything and urged him to reconsider, because painkillers only provide temporary relief, and his spine was not eternal. Tony admitted that it was very difficult for him to find a position with the same high salary. The doctor said that in that case, he had nothing more to add. Then, suddenly, he shouted at Tony, telling him that if he continued like this, he might as well not come to him anymore. He instructed the nurse to take Tony out, saying that with this attitude, he was no longer willing to have him in his office. After Tony left the office, Hank took out his phone, opened his banking app, and transferred 2 million to a woman named Hannah. He then leaned back in his chair, sighed, and thought to himself that Hannah's life had gone downhill since she met her husband. Tony soon arrived at another hospital where his mother, Hannah, was lying in one of the rooms. He sat down next to her bed, thinking to himself that he was a real idiot. He then asked her if it was painful for her to undergo all these procedures. Hannah assured him that she was fine and didn't want him to worry. She then asked if he had recently sent her money, adding that she was fine and didn't need such a large amount. When Tony asked about the money, she showed him the screen of her phone, which displayed an incoming transfer of 2 million won. Tony didn't know what to say. He didn't understand who made the transfer and suspected it might have been the construction manager, the foreman, or Uncle Hank. Hannah then asked her son how he was doing at the company. Tony replied that it wasn't difficult for him at all and that he was doing well, even though he had only just finished school. The woman sighed, expressing her sorrow that her son was having a hard time and that she couldn't support him due to her illness. Tony suggested that she sleep, noticing that she was already quite tired. Hannah agreed, admitting that she had been getting tired very quickly lately, but with her son next to her, she couldn't just go to sleep. Tony assured her that he would stay by her side and that she could rest. He then took her hand, and she finally agreed to sleep a little. After some time, Hannah discovered that Tony had fallen asleep on the bench next to her bed. She stood up, covered him with her blanket, and thought to herself that her son was completely selfless. He had the same scent that his father had when he was still alive, a scent characteristic of a man working on a construction site. She couldn't help but notice what he had been doing all this time. She promised herself that she would definitely overcome her illness and help her son, who was now, unfortunately, trying to do everything alone, for which she was immensely grateful. Soon, a new day dawned, and Tony returned to the construction site. Some of the workers were already sitting in one of the workrooms. The gray-haired man, one of the bosses, noticed two guys approaching the building. It was Tony and John. Tony greeted Kevin, his boss, who immediately noticed John's disheveled appearance and asked if he hadn't washed. John admitted that he had drunk a little the previous night. Kevin told him to start work as soon as he cleaned himself up, adding that if they saw Alung Group employees today, they should avoid them. Kevin then turned to Tony and asked him to bring him a cup of coffee with 1 spoonful of sugar. As they sat down at the table, Kevin asked Tony how he was feeling. Tony replied that everything was the same, but he was getting worse. Kevin then asked him if he wanted to become a carpenter, as they were in high demand. He mentioned that instead of earning 110,000 won, Tony would receive 150,000 won. Tony replied that he didn't mind but was afraid his back wouldn't hold up. Kevin praised him for his dedication and said he really appreciated that quality in him. Tony thought about the fact that the money obviously didn't come from the boss, and how hard it was for him to continue working despite the pain and inconvenience. He also pondered the identity of the unknown person sending his mother money. Then he decided to call Uncle Hank to thank him for his help, saying that he guessed that it was he who sent his mother the money. He said that he would definitely repay him for his kindness. Then Stephen asked if he really never left the construction site. When the doctor realized that the guy was still working there, he screamed at him, telling him to finally listen and quit. After that, he hung up, and at that moment, pain pierced Tony's back again. The guy was upset that his uncle was constantly lecturing him. At that moment, a strange message appeared on his phone. He was extremely surprised by what he saw. It was exactly what he expected after 200 refusals. The message said that Alung was congratulating Tony for making it to the second round of interviews, and they were expecting him at the office in a few days. Suddenly, a strange blue screen appeared in front of the young man. When he looked up, he saw that a strange inscription was written on the screen, which said that his wish had come true. The hero did not understand how to react to all this. He extended his fingers to the screen, but his hand simply passed through it. The guy did not understand why this screen did not disappear and why he could see something like this. He suspected that he was starting to go crazy. Then, suddenly, the system informed him that he had joined the Alung employee course and asked him if he wanted to start training. At that moment, he approached one of the workers and asked him for a favor. The man thought he just wanted a cigarette. He pointed ahead of him and asked if he could see the sign hovering above him. The man suddenly screamed, asking if he had really gone crazy or had just had time to drink somewhere in the morning. Tony hurried to apologize and leave. When he ran inside the building, he realized that no one could see this thing. He understood why the man reacted that way, because he too would be taken aback if someone talked to him about it. He was really the only one who could see this nonsense. Then, he went into the restroom and stood in front of the mirror. The screen was not visible in the reflection, but it still hung over him. Tony thought this was complete madness. He assumed that he was just dreaming it all. He wanted to get into this company, but this strange training was something incomprehensible. He had seen this in TV series, but it was still difficult for him to accept what was happening to him. However, becoming part of a large company was his dream. He decided that he would undergo this training no matter what it cost him. The system told him that if he gave up halfway through, he would lose his memories of the course. But Tony was determined. He said he was willing to take the risk. Then the system told him that he would get a job as a reward and gave him a skill called the potential employee perspective. When Tony walked away from the mirror, he realized that everything was swimming before his eyes. While trying to come to his senses, the system informed him that the skill assessing skills and performance could identify possible problems with long-term use. A debuff called unfitness appeared, so Tony should only use this skill when necessary. After some time, the hero went to the bookstore, still thinking that he did not understand how such a skill could affect the environment. He decided that by using this ability, he would be able to see something. After that, he approached the stand with books. He closed his eyes, psyching himself up to use the skill, and soon decided to try it. He opened his eyes, mentally trying to activate the potential employee's gaze. However, the longer he looked at the books, the more clearly he realized that nothing special was happening. Soon, the system appeared in front of him again. It said that this skill was only available in the buildings of the Alung Group Company. Then he cried out loud, saying that this system had too many requirements. He ended up buying a bunch of books from the store. However, before unpacking them, he went to a construction site to test his skills. When he opened the books, he saw that in 2 of the 12 books, some paragraphs glowed with a bright green light. He returned the rest of the books to the store, and those books that had notes in them, he read all night long. Soon, the day of the interview arrived, and Tony opened his closet to find clothes suitable for the day. The system told him that a neat, classic suit would be his best choice. The hero was shaking, but he understood that the main thing in such a situation was not to be nervous. Soon, he went outside. It was a pleasant, sunny day. The hero sat down at the bus stop and continued reading the book with the notes. He continued reading it even while on the bus, although the constant pop-up messages irritated him. On the other hand, he realized that they were not very helpful to him. Soon, one of the company's employees told him that the interview room was on the 2nd floor. However, Tony suddenly heard company workers behind him, a man and a woman, quietly talking to each other. The woman told him that this guy had a 98,061, which is an excellent score. The system informed him that he had passed the appearance assessment. Tony sighed resignedly, saying that the general information about the interview stated that appearance does not matter. The Lung Group gave full freedom to applicants, but at the same time, carefully assessed their every step. The company occupied a significant position in various areas, including fashion, logistics, real estate, tourism, etc. It was intimidating in its scale. Soon, Tony and the rest of the candidates went to the interview room, where they took their places and had to take the test. Many of those present were very nervous, not knowing how to answer the questions. There is a big difference between those who know the answers to questions and those who don't. At least that's where Tony had an advantage. Soon, men and women entered the office. A girl introduced herself as Kimberly, saying that she joined the company in 2017 and that today she would be evaluating skills. The man's name was Connor, and he mentioned that he had been working at the company since 2014 and would assist the candidates with testing. They acknowledged that some candidates had come from afar and asked if anyone had experienced any inconvenience on the way to the interview. One of the candidates raised her hand to ask a question. She mentioned that she had traveled a long distance and added that in many companies, all travel expenses are covered by the employer. She wanted to know if their company paid for the trip. Tony thought to himself that no company would want to hire a candidate with such an attitude. The next moment, the system informed him that the girl, who was a potential employee, had been eliminated. Tony then realized that he needed to keep writing down the results. He wondered about the test, which had 200 questions, and whether he had to solve everything or if he should make a couple of mistakes. Half an hour was allotted for the 200 questions, and soon Tony realized that he had a minute left. He decided that he did not have to complete the test perfectly. He didn't know who gave him this ability, but he decided that it would be a sin not to use it. He must do everything in his power. When the test was over, Tony went to one of the establishments to meet his colleagues from the construction site. Stephen asked him why he hadn't come to work yesterday, since Tony never missed a day of work. Stephen assumed that Tony had a girlfriend, so he suggested that he take her somewhere decent. Tony apologized and thought to himself that if he said he went to an interview with a large company, he would be considered a rat. Stephen laughed, saying that Tony was just a young guy, and added that he now understood where Tony spent all his earned money. Tony hadn't thought about the fact that he had become very friendly with the foreman and the others. If it weren't for his back, he would have continued to work there. At that moment, a blue screen appeared in front of him again. The system recommended that he be prepared for the outcome of the interview. The system said there was a task related to the interview. The general task required him to prepare for the final interview, during which he would need to answer the director's questions. Tony was a little angry. He couldn't believe that the system was inviting him to meet with the director himself, but the punishment for not showing up was a change of construction site. Stephen was distracted from his dinner by the sound of his cell phone. It turned out his boss, Kevin, was calling him. Kevin asked Stephen to arrange a meeting for him and Tony. Stephen said he would send Tony to him right away, then turned to Tony and said that the boss wanted to talk to him. Stephen smiled as he asked what was wrong, since Tony didn't look surprised at all. Tony sighed, saying that his boss was paying him, so there was no point in avoiding him. He then left the establishment, realizing that he needed to go forward and talk to the boss. Soon, Tony arrived at the construction site. The atmosphere between him and Kevin was quite tense. Kevin said that he tried his best, and that's why tomorrow Tony would work as a carpenter for the senior foreman. Tony asked him why he made such a sudden decision. Kevin shouted, asking where else he could find someone like Tony. He asked what he would do without the carpenter. Tony replied that he was fine with everything. Kevin said he would find someone who could paint the walls, but finding a carpenter was not so easy. He couldn't lose someone like Tony. Tony was very bothered by the fact that the boss shouted at him for so long. It was impossible to talk. At that moment, the system informed him that he had a side quest open. He needed to listen to the boss's story to the end since the boss considered him a good person. Tony was not very happy with this task, but he had no choice. He turned to Kevin, asking him to be a little quieter. He said that he would listen to him, and then he would have to tell his boss something. Kevin then said that now that he didn't have a second carpenter, he couldn't complete the construction plan. Because of this, he was losing millions each day. Then he screamed again, saying Tony couldn't leave. The hero thought that this was 100% his fault. He decided that he had to retreat, so Kevin asked him to help for at least a week. Tony didn't really want to agree, but decided that he would help, but only for a week. Kevin was immediately happy and thanked him, saying that he was trying to take care of him. He thanked Tony for coming to him and said this was the only time he had asked him for something like that. Kevin then pulled his phone out of his pocket and called the president, saying that everything had been decided and that they would be able to complete the plan in a week. Within 7 days, they would finish construction. Soon, evening came, and the workers asked the boss how everything went. He said that everything was fine. Soon, 2 men approached Tony. One was his boss, Stephen, and next to him stood a man Tony didn't know. Stephen asked Tony to come down, telling him to say hello to the director of the alum group. Tony did not come down from the stepladder, but shook the man's hand, saying that this was their first meeting. The director said his name was Charlie. He began to worry when he learned that the construction plan was in jeopardy and once again thanked Tony for his help. Although the hero grinned, saying that he was glad to help, he thought to himself that he was only there for a week since his back was already starting to fail. Charlie then said that the day after tomorrow, he was going to the office, and since it was his last time here, he offered the men a drink. However, Tony looked away in embarrassment, saying that he couldn't go because he had an appointment tomorrow. After work, he went back to the hospital to see Uncle Hank. As soon as he entered the office, everyone else in the hospital heard a terrifying scream. The doctor tried to fix his back, but the situation was already so dire that any touch caused incredible pain for Tony. The doctor then told him to go to the second floor for physical therapy. The pain brought tears to Tony's eyes, and he was very worried about an upcoming interview. The doctor continued to reproach him for not caring about his health. The next day, Tony finally arrived at the alum group for his interview. Along with 2 other candidates, he appeared before the directors. The hero introduced himself, saying his name was Tony. When he looked up, he saw a familiar face. Charlie, the same director of the company he had met last night. Charlie grinned, saying that this was not their first meeting, and invited Tony to sit down. When all the candidates were seated, the directors decided to proceed with the interviews. Charlie expressed his desire to start first, and the others supported him. He turned to one of the candidates and asked him to stand up. Noticing the man's attire, white socks with black trousers, Charlie asked him what he thought about his appearance. The candidate replied that the clothes did not seem to match well. Tony wondered if the system had warned him about the high-pressure nature of this stage. Charlie then asked why the candidate wore such clothes, especially since he thought they looked poor. Tony realized that the atmosphere in the room made the candidates very uncomfortable, revealing their hidden traits. The candidate could not answer Charlie's question. When Charlie pressed him on why he was silent, questioning whether he could control his emotions, Tony understood that restraint and emotional control were crucial in this situation. Seeing the candidate's confusion, Charlie sighed in displeasure. The man was too stressed to speak and could not handle the situation. When everyone realized this, Charlie asked him to sit down and began interviewing the next candidate. It soon became clear that the girl had no experience in social work, and despite her attempts to justify herself, Charlie said this was not what their company needed. When he asked her how she planned to work with clients, tears appeared in her eyes, and she did not know how to respond. The girl's interview ended shortly, and she left the room in tears. Tony realized that Charlie had asked the first question to throw everyone off guard, as the remaining questions required mental preparation. Soon, it was Tony's turn. He stood up from his chair and proudly introduced himself. Tony was determined to leave with something. Charlie asked about Tony's education. Tony replied that he was an expert in banking, but Charlie knew he had not studied at a university. Tony admitted that he did not receive a college education. Charlie then asked if there was anything else Tony wanted to say. Fearing that a wrong answer might remove him from the list of candidates, Tony decided to be honest. He said he needed to make money, and Charlie noted that they were doing the same thing, asking why Tony chose a job over university. Tony said he did not regret his decision. Instead of studying, he worked at a construction site and spent his evenings on self-education. Although he did not attend college, he completed online courses and qualified as a technician. Tony tried to compensate for his lack of university education and succeeded in obtaining an education in the economic field. Charlie was very surprised by this answer. He turned to his colleagues and smiled, saying it was wonderful. With that, Charlie's part of the interview was over, and he handed the floor to his colleagues. One of them asked Tony what he could do for their company. Tony knew this was a difficult question, but was ready for it. He said the work was not too stressful, the pay was good enough to cover his mom's hospital bills, and he wouldn't have to worry about his health or daily needs. He also mentioned that as long as the work did not contradict laws and societal norms, he was ready for anything. The man then asked why Tony had such conditions. Tony replied that otherwise, the image and future of the company would be compromised. He supported the integrity of the company and its contribution to the development of the country. Only if these conditions were met would a lung group move in the right direction toward its goals. Tony understood that his answer was not perfect, but aimed to convince them that there is no such thing as a perfect answer, as the interview was meant to test how people behave in stressful situations. The man then asked Tony if he had a girlfriend. Tony said he did not, and noted that there were practically no women around him. He added that if someone suitable came along, he would be happy to meet her, which made Charlie laugh. Charlie then praised Tony for doing an excellent job in the interview and declared that it was over, allowing all candidates to leave. Evening came, and Tony returned to the construction site. Stephen approached him, surprised to see Tony there. He waved and mentioned that he had a lot to do in the control room today. Noticing that Tony looked a little off, Stephen asked what was wrong. Tony wanted to explain, but their conversation was interrupted by a strange sound. Jonna decided to approach them, but tripped over a beam and fell. Tony wondered if John was in trouble again, but had too much work to worry about it. Stephen then invited Tony to dinner with them, but Tony said he wanted to talk to the boss first. Everyone, including Stephen, was curious about what Tony needed to discuss. Tony revealed he was finishing his last week there, which greatly surprised them. At that moment, the system sent him a new task. He needed to attend an evening event and listen to stories. There was no reward or penalty for refusal, which was unusual for system orders. Tony asked the boss what was for dinner. Stephen grinned and said they would have soup. Tony added that if the boss fed him beef, he would consider switching sides. John and his partner were pleased with Tony's decision and also wanted to try the meat. Stephen feigned dissatisfaction but agreed to the request because everyone was asking. Soon, the men arrived at the establishment and decided to toast to a good day. Stephen remarked that the week had been tough, noting that fewer people wanted to become engineers. His brother was a gas worker, and Stephen himself had worked in his specialty for 20 years. He didn't understand the point of studying if it was so difficult to make good money, so he decided not to study further, believing it was useless. John commented that this attitude was due to Stephen being too old. At that moment, Tony thought that even in his drunken state, Stephen was speaking the truth about the difficulties faced by the technical staff. The industry was driven by science, technology, and pharmaceuticals. When everyone was too drunk to think clearly, Tony looked out the window at the city at night. A whole week had passed since the evening at the Alung group. Suddenly, his boss called him and asked why he hadn't shown up for work. Tony explained that he had requested a day off for rest, but Stephen insisted that Tony come to work because he had been up all night and didn't want to work alone. Tony said he couldn't go in and wouldn't be coming in the next day. Before Stephen could respond, Tony hung up. At that moment, one of the company employees approached Tony and said she would take him to the debate location. She explained that the second interview involved a discussion among 10 people, and Tony could join according to the speaker's instructions. The group discussion topic was OECD countries, with South Korea as part of the Commonwealth Economic Development Organization. They would discuss high education prices and potential solutions. When all the candidates arrived, the presenter instructed them to raise their hands, state their number and name, and only then speak. Tony realized this was exactly what he had been worried about, as the topic required a wide range of social work experience. He mentally thanked the group leader for the invaluable experience. The man leading the debate began making notes on his tablet and said they should start. Tony raised his head confidently, preparing for the group interview. He was assigned number 2. The discussion began, and number 3 joined, raising his hand and stating that the recent economic situation had significantly impacted the country. As a result, education prices have increased greatly. He suggested that to be among the top 10 economically strong countries, they should not skimp on human resources. If education prices decreased, they could provide more talented individuals. Tony looked at him in surprise, thinking the guy was a real idiot. The discussion topic had already been said about the reasons for increased tuition costs and potential solutions, but this candidate merely repeated the question without offering an answer. Tony was glad he had waited to answer, as he now had time to think. Soon, the discussion turned to participant number 7. The girl mentioned that her parents spent 300 million won to provide her with a good education. Such amounts led to a decrease in the birth rate because not every parent could afford that for several children. She believed it was necessary to encourage increased birth rates and raise payments to families with children. Number 3 agreed, stating that families were breaking up, birth rates were falling, and tuition costs were rising. Encouraging more births was a great solution. Tony thought this sounded good, but the company had nothing to do with it since it was not a government enterprise. Therefore, they didn't need to worry about such issues. He raised his hand, offering to consider the situation from another perspective. This statement surprised speakers number 3 and 7. Tony said that their country ranked first in the world for education costs and second in the number of applicants. He then stood up and went to the board, suggesting that they should discuss the quality of education. He asked everyone present to look at the education ranking of OECD countries. The quality of the education system ranks 75th. From a young age, individuals have the choice to continue their education after school or not. This contrasts with Germany, where education is compulsory. In their country, people have the right to choose where to study, whether it be college, university, or through self-education. As a result, the number of jobs matches the demand. And although the average salary is higher than in Korea, the difference in income across different specialties is not so great. However, there is a personnel imbalance in their country. Support for fields such as science, IT, and other technologies is insufficient. In particular, the majority of engineering positions are occupied by foreign workers. Tony believed that if their education system became more streamlined, like in Germany, it would bring benefits. It would reduce the cost of education in the country and aid its overall development. When he looked at the other debaters, he saw doubt in their eyes. He realized that they were confused by the way he connected these facts. Then participant number 10 asked if he really thought so. It seemed to him that participant number 2 was dissatisfied with their country's education system. Tony was extremely surprised by this statement. He did not expect open attacks, but he understood that the main thing in such situations is not to panic. He then apologized if he had offended anyone, clarifying that his goal was not to slander their country. Participant number 10 said that he really did not like Tony's words. He felt that the foreign education system did not account for their country's traditions and believed that introducing such a system would be a huge mistake. They have enough outstanding and talented people. Everyone here was educated in Seoul or abroad and was sitting here only because of their knowledge. He didn't understand why participant number 2 thought they were less worthy than the Germans. Then the debate leader turned to participant number 10 and asked his name. The man replied that his name was Ian. The manager thanked him for his participation and said he could be free. When Ian heard this, his face turned red, either from misunderstanding or anger. The manager said that he did not think Ian was suitable for their company, but thanked him for his good work. Tony thought about the fact that nowadays companies need talent who can integrate into the team, and Ian seemed to belittle others, considering himself superior. Given the company's requirements, Ian was the worst candidate. There was no point in hiring someone who wanted to be the center of attention, crowding out the rest. After that, Ian left the hall, loudly slamming the door behind him. The leaders then introduced the second topic, dedicated to national pension reform. The debate participants discussed this topic extensively. Tony thought that it would never end. 25 minutes passed, and they still had opposition of opinions that could not be resolved. He wanted it all to end quickly. Judging by the examiner's face, he was also tired of it. Tony decided to speak out, saying that at this rate, they would not reach a consensus. However, by summing up each speech, 2 prevailing views could be identified. Participant number 1 said that national and occupational pensions should be integrated following the example of Japan, while participant number 6 responded that the lack of national pensions could be supplemented by private payments. Tony suggested listening to one more person and then summing up the results by voting. The examiner noted to himself that there was a heated discussion within the team, but this guy, Tony, was silent. Usually people like him mediate disputes, and these are the people their company needs. Soon, he thanked all the participants for their work and said that they were done for the day. After everyone left, he made a note next to Tony's name saying that this guy sure did it. When Tony left the office, he heard someone screaming. The man was saying that he had been treated unfairly. When Tony turned around, he saw that participant number 10 was arguing with the examiner, claiming that he had been kicked out undeservedly. Tony realized that there were people who did not admit their mistakes. As he blinked, he saw that the examiner seemed to be covered in a green aura. Tony didn't understand why his skill was activated now. Each person looked completely different in his eyes. He turned around to look at the other people in the corridor. Behind him stood a man and a woman. The woman had an orange aura, and the man had a yellow aura. Today's interview turned out to be useful. He learned something new. Firstly, if you blink 3 times in a row, it activates automatically. Secondly, each color is characteristic of a certain person. It can be red, orange, or green. He assumed that red indicated people under 20, orange for people over 20, and green for people over 30. However, he doubted that they were divided strictly by age. After some time, Tony returned to his job at a construction site. While he was working, a new message arrived on his phone. It said that he had an interview with the Alung Group. The last interview with the directors will take place tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at the company's main building. Tony was extremely happy about this news. He was glad that the day of the last interview was finally approaching, but he understood that staying vigilant was important. He decided he must remain calm and pass the final interview to fulfill his dream. After that, he approached John and gave him advice, saying that he was putting too much paint on the roller, which would make it run out faster. However, the guy did not hear him and again took a huge amount of paint, then sent it upward to paint the walls. When Tony looked up, he saw a huge amount of paint flying toward his face. All the paint ended up on his head. John immediately climbed down from the stepladder, apologizing to his partner. Although Tony was very unhappy, he said that John shouldn't worry about such little things. John continued to apologize, saying that he was very sorry, but the hero reassured him that he was fine. Tony then headed towards the showers and met his supervisor, Steven, along the way. Steven asked him what had happened, to which Tony replied that it was nothing special, just work issues, and said that he would go to the hostel to wash himself. Steven suggested that since it was far away, he should use the bathhouse on the first floor, which was open today. Tony had no doubts and was sure of how the other workers would react. Steven mentioned that everyone was expected to come and wash after work, so there would be no misunderstanding. Tony went down the stairs to wash off the paint. It was very uncomfortable for him to walk around with his hair stuck together. Soon, he arrived at the right door. When he walked inside, he immediately took off all his dirty clothes and headed to the shower. After taking a hot shower and washing off all the paint, he encountered a man in the middle of the room. The man was already there and asked what Tony was doing. Tony told him he was a construction worker. The man suggested that this must be very hard work, as Tony was covered in paint from head to toe. Tony smiled and asked if the man was really the boss there. When the man confirmed he was in charge, Tony became delighted and praised the bathhouse, calling it wonderful. He then asked if he was paid well. The man said he was paid enough, which was sufficient not to envy others. Tony thanked him again for his work. Suddenly, the man dived sharply under the water. Tony panicked, thinking that the man had suddenly become ill and might drown. He rushed to help, intending to pull him out from under the water. At that moment, the man emerged and laughed, asking if Tony really thought he was dead. He explained that he had a curse and always had to press down on the back path, especially after sweating a lot. Tony found this very interesting, but thought to himself that it was important to identify possible inconveniences for clients by testing them personally. He told the man he was an excellent specialist and looked very healthy. The man advised Tony to also take care of his health, not forgetting to exercise and eat well while he was still young. Then he stood up, saying it was time for him to go. Tony wished him luck and good health, hoping he would do well. The man smiled and said he hoped everything would be fine with Tony. When Tony left the bathhouse, a man in a suit came in after him. He headed straight inside the bathhouse and called out to the president. It turned out he was the same man. The man said that the closing ceremony would take place in 40 minutes and asked if Tony would attend. The president, Christopher, had a curse. If he took a bath here after construction, an accident would definitely happen within a year. The man hoped everything would be fine this year. Soon, the day of the final interview arrived. Tony tried to stay as calm and collected as possible. The system told him that all he had to do was pass the final interview, but Tony was unhappy, saying that it was not that easy. When the system advised him to trust it, he sighed and said that since it was not going to help, he would do everything himself. He needed to remember everything from the company's past to the events of today. He was soon accepted into the company and greeted everyone present, thanking them for giving him a chance. Then the chairman of the commission asked Tony to sit down. Tony thought about the system's advice not to worry, but he knew that luck alone wouldn't help in a meeting with the directors. He decided it was time to use his skill. Looking at the directors, he saw that one of them was emitting a blue aura and the other a violet one. They all appeared to be over 50 years old. He doubted whether they were really directors. One of the men mentioned that Tony had applied for a leadership position related to credit and banking. The man approached another director and remarked that Tony had not studied at any college or university. He asked how Tony had educated himself. The man said Tony must be very good to have gotten this far and asked the assistant to provide the results of past interviews. Soon, All the directors saw that Tony had the highest marks in the interview. They were extremely surprised that he had performed better than graduates of the most popular universities in the country. The assistant leaned over to one of the directors, suggesting that Tony could be classified as an SSS-level candidate. This group usually includes relatives and descendants of the chairman's family or ordinary individuals who have reached their level. The director then approached Tony and asked what kind of work he would like to do. Tony said he would prefer an office job, but would be happy with whatever activity they assigned him. When the director said that Tony could not go yet, the hero was extremely surprised. The director said that the interview was over and thanked him for his time. As Tony left, they began discussing whether he could be a relative of the chairman or someone from his circle, and decided to carefully check this information. One of the directors suggested that he was deliberately disguised as an ordinary economist so that they would not suspect anything. Another man agreed, saying that the chairman's policy was to start from the very bottom. All this was too suspicious. Since the HR department noticed at first, they should not make mistakes either. They assumed that a person from the SSS group had come to them. The story takes place in an expensive building. A young man came to the office of his father, who was extremely dissatisfied that his son decided to appear after so much time. He said that his son had failed, although he had been preparing for so long. Such a shame had never happened in their family. The young man said he was very sorry and asked his father to give him another chance. When the man started yelling at him, saying that he didn't show up for the interview and had failed, the young man clenched his fists in anger. Then the man again turned to his son, named Tony. He told him to speak openly and not hide anything. The story shifts again to the construction site. It was just another one of Tony's working days. He received a message on his phone saying that he had been hired for a position at the Alum Group. Tony knew that it would not be easy to pass the interview with the directors, and he had a feeling that it was a waste of time. He then received another message saying that he needed to attend a mandatory medical examination at the regional hospital, but he could also provide medical reports from another hospital. Tony did not know what to do. He wanted to get a job in the company because of his back, but now he doubted that this would become a hindrance. He decided to go to the hospital to see Uncle Hank. When he entered the office, the doctor asked if his back was hurting again. Tony scratched the back of his head and said he was fine today. He said he had a final interview for a position at a large company. Hank was very happy for him, saying that now he would finally not put unnecessary strain on his spine. However, he had a feeling that something was wrong. Tony lowered his head in shame and said that this was nonsense. He understood that he could only ask his uncle about this, but could not utter a word. Then he said that he wanted a prescription for painkillers. Hank said he guessed that the guy came here for this reason. When he looked at Tony, he realized that he looked very sad. This surprised Hank, as Tony usually had a very confident attitude. Hank did not understand what the problem was. He remembered Tony's words that he had passed the final interview at a large company. Then Hank thought that since Tony was going to get a job, he needed to undergo a medical examination. He realized what Tony wanted from him and understood that if he was caught, he could easily lose his license. However, Hank suddenly started typing something on his computer, thinking that Tony was just like his father, making everyone worry about him. Soon after, Tony went downstairs to get a prescription from the nurse. She gave him something else. As it turned out, it was a disc. At that moment, Tony heard Hank's voice from behind him and decided to congratulate him again. Hank said that Tony would pay for his medications as soon as he received his first salary. Tony smiled, realizing that his uncle had helped him a lot. Soon, Tony went back home and received another message from the company stating that he had passed the general personnel selection process at Alum Group. Tony understood that he survived only thanks to his uncle's help, and this made him feel very good. At that moment, a system window appeared above his head again, informing him that the employee store was available to Tony and his current balance was equal to 5 points. The system reported that the store was an excellent tool to help solve problems that arise during work. One could buy special items for points earned by completing tasks. When a window appeared in front of Tony, allowing him to open a store for employees, he immediately agreed. Soon the system window expanded. Among the goods for new employees, there was a sobering pill that instantly removes alcohol from the body, vision lenses that allow you to see through walls within a radius of 2 meters for 1 minute, a candy that prevents drowsiness for 6 hours, and a charming aroma that makes the owner attractive to the opposite sex with double the effect. Tony couldn't believe his eyes. It seemed like a game or some kind of magic. The system asked him if he wanted to lose his memory, and Tony hastened to explain that he did not mean that. The system said it was there to help him be successful, and he refused to do so. Tony apologized for saying it wrong and asked the system not to take it too seriously. Then the system said it understood the user's words, but Tony needed to be more careful. Such a statement made Tony very angry. Why did the system give him a quest to talk to his mother and reassure her by telling her that he had found a job in a new company? As a reward, he would receive 6 points and also open a side quest. As punishment, the side quest would remain closed. Tony thought that even if it weren't for the system, he was still going to visit his mother, which he did shortly. He came to her room and knocked on the door. When Hannah realized her son had arrived, she smiled. She said she was feeling better, so her son had nothing to worry about. Then Tony decided to tell her that he had been hired by the Alung Group. Hannah was very happy, saying that this was great news. Tony replied that, in this case, she needed to get better, and they would go home together. Hannah mentioned that her aunt had bought and brought her a whole box of apples and offered to take a few for her son. Tony was delighted to see his mother finally smiling. She said that her son had studied hard and got a position in a good company, so she was very happy for him. Tony stood up and said he was going to the nurse to get a stroller. He asked his mother to wait for him and went into the corridor. When he left the room, the system informed him that the quest had been completed. It then told him that Hank was very worried about his mother, so Tony should call him and ask him to come to the hospital. He would receive 5 points, and there would be no punishment. When Tony saw the name of the quest, First Love, he was shocked. He did not understand what the system meant by this because Hank was his father's best friend. His father and Uncle Hank were best friends when they were young. Hank was the same friend who came and scolded his father every time for not taking care of his health. Tony remembered these moments well from his childhood. Now, the hero realizes that all this time, Hank has not been married. He still couldn't get over the fact that his father's best friend was in love with his mother. Tony turned to the system, asking if all this was true. The system replied that it did not know how to lie. Tony asked why the system was giving him this task, and the system replied that it was doing this for the success of a user named Tony. The hero did not understand who was behind this system. However, the system responded that such information was not available to him. The hero looked around, not understanding what he should do since the task had a time limit. With about half an hour left, he headed back to his mother's room and stood near the door. When he went inside, his mother asked him where he had been for so long. Tony said he needed to call. Hannah said that if he was busy, he could go, but Tony replied that he was fine. Then he decided to ask his mother if she remembered Uncle Hank. Hannah was surprised by the question, and Tony was also surprised by her reaction. His mother's tone made him feel a little strange, perhaps because his father had died. He got up and said he would call, and then return to her. The hero headed towards the exit from the ward, taking his phone out of his pocket as he went. He dialed Uncle Hank's number. The doctor had not expected this call. Tony decided to ask him directly if he liked his mother. The doctor did not know how to answer. He asked if something had really happened to Hannah. Without waiting for an answer, he immediately jumped up from his seat and asked which hospital they were in. Tony replied that they were at Seoul General Hospital, number 403, and then hung up. At that moment, the system appeared near him again. It said that the hero had made a great choice, but Tony was extremely dissatisfied with how this strange thing behaved. He asked the system again what it was, but it did not answer. 15 minutes after the call, Uncle Hank showed up at the hospital. He quickly ran down the corridor, not paying attention to anyone, including Tony. He came running in his hospital gown and eventually met Hannah, their first meeting since the death of Tony's father. Soon, the system informed Tony that the quest had been completed, and as a reward, he received 5 points. When Tony calmed down and thought soberly, he came to a conclusion he considered the only correct one. He looked at the system window and wondered if all this could be true. Then he asked if his father was really behind the system. The system had provided him with one-sided assistance, sometimes turning into threats, but it had done everything to help him. However, the system said it could not answer this question. Tony suggested again that this was exactly what his father was doing, and that was why the system did not answer directly. However, the system did not respond. The hero decided he was still interested in what kind of creature this was and would learn about it gradually. For now, he had something else to worry about. He wondered what his mom and Uncle Hank were doing at the moment. When he looked through the door window, he saw them talking to each other. Although he did not hear the conversation, he saw that there was a smile on his mother's face. Uncle Hank smiled too, and Tony had never seen such a sincere smile on his face. The system again informed the hero that he had made a good choice. Soon, it was 10 p.m., and all guests had to leave the hospital. Hank left the room and saw Tony outside the door. He assumed that Tony had eavesdropped on their conversation, but the hero said he had just come here. The doctor approached him and apologized for his behavior, but Tony said that Hank had nothing to apologize for. Hank said he was grateful for Tony's help and for calling him, but now it was time for him to go. Finally, Tony asked Hank again if he liked his mother. Hank looked away in embarrassment, saying he didn't know how to answer this question. Tony looked down with displeasure. He expected a clearer answer. He told his uncle that for the next 3 days he would be at the training center. His aunt sometimes came to see his mother, but he would like his uncle to come sometimes too. Tony paid his mother's medical bills and sent her for a medical examination at the company. Now, the hero realized that all this was not because of his friendship with his dad, but because of his mother. He couldn't understand his feelings, so he told Hank to decide for himself. One way or another, he and Hank were the only ones who could take care of Hannah. Hank said he understood. What the guy meant was that he would think about it, because it wasn't an easy decision. Tony spent the next 3 days at the training center. When he returned to the construction site, the manager said that tomorrow they would move to a new site. He asked the workers to go to bed early so they could start work as soon as possible. Then Tony approached him, saying he had something to say. Steve suggested that Tony wanted to take the day off. He said the guy had to go out, as the manager was taking a long weekend and there was no one to work. Tony then said that he had found a new job and therefore had to leave. Steven shouted, asking how much he needed to pay him to change his mind. He asked if it would be enough if he made $4 million a month there. Tony apologized for what he had said earlier and mentioned that he had passed the final interview at a lung group. At first, Steven couldn't believe his ears. When he realized Tony was serious, his face contorted in shock. Tony then said he would not be able to come on shift tomorrow. Steven was extremely surprised, noting that Tony hadn't even studied at university yet and was interviewed at such a large company. The hero looked away shyly, not knowing what to answer. Steven then said he needed to work hard to avoid losing face. Tony didn't look up, saying he was truly sorry. At that moment, John and his partner approached them. John asked if it was time to eat since Tony was leaving. Steven shouted at him, noting that they were discussing Tony leaving, and all John could think about was food. One of the workers then said his wife had called, and he needed to return home. Steven was very unhappy that the man wanted to leave early. However, the worker said he was gone all day at work and sometimes wanted to be at home. He mentioned that even Tony decided to quit. There was an awkward pause between the men. Steven turned to Tony again. Tony assumed he would start telling him off, but Steven invited him to dinner. He said he wasn't offering it because he liked Tony, but because he felt awkward. Tony smiled, understanding that even though the leader said so, he remained himself until the end. When they arrived at the restaurant, Steven said Tony would not leave until he had eaten well because office work wasn't as easy as it seemed. Tony said he was ready for such work. Steven objected, saying that without a university education, it would be easy for him, and others might mock him if they found out the whole truth. Tony looked up, acknowledging that he understood this but also knew he had to do it. Steven said if things didn't work out at the company, Tony could return. They would always be glad to see him. There would always be a place for Tony there. The hero thanked his boss for such kind words. Then Steven's partner cleared his throat and took something out of his pocket, saying if he had known in advance, he would have prepared a better gift. He pulled out an envelope and handed it to Tony. Tony was surprised and asked what it was. The man asked him to open the envelope and accept it without question, as a real adult would. He said the amount would be enough for several pairs of shoes. Tony immediately raised his hands, saying he could not accept such an amount and asked the man to take the envelope back. At that moment, John took the envelope and said he would take the money if Tony didn't want it. The man immediately yelled at him, telling him to give the envelope back to Tony. John was surprised by such a sharp reaction and returned the money. Tony smiled, saying he would still accept it. He was glad that even despite his departure, the men were kind to him. That day, he saw his former colleagues for the last time. The very next day, he joined a lung group. Tony took a large black suitcase with him and went to the bus. He greeted the man in charge of boarding the bus and said his name. The man immediately looked at his tablet to check the data and told Tony to get on the first bus. However, he suddenly stopped Tony and asked if he was really born in '92. Tony replied that it was not his year of birth. As it turned out, he was born in 1994. When the man heard this, he said Tony needed to get on the third bus, leave his luggage in the cargo compartment, and go inside. Tony thought about the fact that apparently someone else had the same name as him. After getting on the bus, he kept thinking about it. His name was not the most common, so the situation was quite surprising. He finally found his seat, sat down, and breathed a sigh of relief. The bus manager then announced that since everyone was seated, they were going to the training center for new employee training. Tony smiled, realizing he was now the company's new employee. He was distracted from his thoughts by a message from Hank, who asked him not to worry about his mother and to work hard. At that moment, one of the men sitting on the bus suddenly stood in the middle of the aisle. He greeted everyone, saying his name was Marvin. He was the deputy director of the sales department of a lung group's branch in one of the cities and was in charge of the third bus. He also thanked everyone for their work. Everyone on the bus thanked him as well. Marvin said he would be their supervisor for the next 4 weeks at the training center. He asked if they had decided on their type of activity. Everyone present on the bus began to awkwardly look at each other, not understanding what the man was talking about. Then he said that he had asked the question incorrectly and asked those who already knew which department they wanted to work in to raise their hands. As it turned out, no one present raised their hand. Marvin said that training and retraining of new employees is an important process in the company. The company monitors employees, evaluates their work, and based on the results of training, offers a position. He joined the company just after such training and was assigned to the sales department, where he is now doing an excellent job. Then one of the employees asked what if he got a job he didn't want to do. Marvin said that, first of all, they should keep their grades at a high level. The top 10 students will be allowed to choose a position independently. The remaining 90% will be distributed by managers. Even with the first option, there is a possibility that the position may not be suitable for the employee. However, there is one loophole. After working for a year, they can apply to change their occupation. He does not recommend this route, as requests may simply be rejected, and the old team may not take them back. When Tony heard this, he was very surprised. He realized that from the very beginning, each of the employees was closely monitored. He wondered what a troublemaker would look like if there was trouble on the team. He didn't know what to do if his health deteriorated and he needed surgery urgently. He was afraid that it would mean leaving his job, losing everything, and having to start over. Tony then firmly decided that he must hold out until the end. Soon, the buses arrived in the desired city. For Tony, this was all new. He felt a little strange, but at the same time had a feeling that a bright future awaited him. After some time, the buses arrived at the company's training center. Marvin looked over all the workers, making sure everyone had gotten off the buses. He said that now all employees would receive their tracksuits of suitable sizes and name badges. Everyone arrived at the center, where their luggage was checked, and they were given the necessary clothing. One of the workers greeted Tony, told him he had been assigned room B13 on the third floor, and asked him to change clothes and explore the assembly area. When Tony raised his head, he saw that the floors were numbered starting from the second with the letters A, B, and C. He was surprised that men and women lived together. However, at this moment, one of the workers said that men were accommodated in rooms 1 to 25 and women from 26 to 50. Tony noted that they were very clever in dividing the workers by gender. After some time, he was already on his floor. Before getting ready, he needed time to change clothes. Soon he found the room he needed. When he went inside, he realized that there was one bed for two. The hero sighed with relief. He had expected that 3 more people would live in the same room with him. He then took out the clothes that were given to him at the entrance. It was a fairly simple tracksuit, and he wondered why they had chosen such uniforms for everyone. At that moment, a young man in a suit and glasses entered the room. Tony turned around to see who had come. The guy grinned, saying that the room was small enough. Tony disagreed and introduced himself. The man scratched his head awkwardly, saying his name was Archie. Tony noted to himself that Archie looked like a good man. He looked older, so the hero wondered if he should bow to him. He approached him, saying that he seemed to be older than him, to which Archie replied that he was 29. Tony chuckled, saying he was 25 and hoped it wouldn't be a problem for them. He asked where he should sleep and suggested that Archie take the second floor. Archie said that in that case, he would stay on the first floor and thanked Tony for his concern because the second floor was too much trouble. Tony said that there was nothing special about it because they would have to live together for a whole month. Then Archie was surprised that Tony got to work so early because he was only 25 years old. He was surprised that Tony graduated from university in 3 years. Tony explained that he received a diploma in lending and banking, so he really received his education earlier than the rest. At that moment, loudspeakers turned on throughout the building. A voice announced that the trainees were expected in 10 minutes in the hall of the main building. The man said they had little time left. Archie chuckled, saying that it felt like they were in the army. Tony agreed and suggested they go to the gym, or they would be late. After some time, Tony noted that the first day was quite good. The leaders apparently wanted to check attendance. More than 260 people gathered in one hall to listen to the speech. The man who spoke on stage said that before they began training new employees of the company, the director of the training department wanted to say a few words to them. At that moment, another man came onto the stage. The man greeted him and bowed, then stepped aside so he could take his place. The bespectacled man leaned toward the microphone, smiled broadly, and greeted the interns. The trainees greeted him back. Then the man said that it was somehow quiet there. He shouted into the microphone, asking if this was what the company's new employees were supposed to be like, and then greeted them again, this time very loudly. The trainees greeted the man as loudly as he did. The director said that until last year, he was the executive director of a Lung Group headquarters. His name is Philip, and at the beginning of this year, he was assigned to the Lung Group Training Center. He said that their group is among the top 5 companies in South Korea, but at first, they were at the bottom. The 60s were difficult years. Philip went to Japan to hone his skills, and then he asked the trainees if they knew where the first refrigerator was made in South Korea. One of the trainees raised his hand and said that it was made by a Lung Group Electronics. Philip said that this was the right answer. It took them 4 years to design and create the first refrigerator. They went through trial and error, and refrigerators were very expensive in those days, but now everyone has this household item. Tony thought about the fact that the director of the training center speech was built around the history of the company. In particular, he talked about its past and future. At this moment, Philip said that from that day on, the trainees were not just new employees. They were the whole future of the Lung Group company. From the moment they entered this training center and throughout their career growth, they would be the people of the Lung Group. He invited them to try for the future of the company starting tomorrow. Soon, the interns met with Marvin again. The man said that lights out began at 10 p.m. After 10, each of the interns would be on duty on the floor in shifts. He said that the trainees should choose a floor leader who would be responsible for organizing their work. Then he asked those who wished to take responsibility to raise their hands. Tony decided that he should try taking on the role of prefect. Some of the other trainees also raised their hands. Tony looked around and saw that, besides him, several people also wanted to try themselves as prefects. When he turned his head the other way, he saw that his roommate, Archie, had also raised his hand.